Good morning, sisters. Here we are again. I hope you are doing well all over the world and that you are ready to have another class on vulnerability and abuse. And today we are going to talk about different forms of abuse and about the prevalence of abuse. So I'm going now to share my screen with you. So that's the title, Terms, Definitions, and Prevalence. So to start and to show you the magnitude, we know that 1 out of 2 children or 1 billion children suffer some form of violence every year. 1 in 3 students aged 11 to 15 suffered bullying in the past month. And the boys were there for 35% and the girls for 30%. 1 in 3 students aged 13 till 15 years were in a physical fight in the last year. Boys 45% and girls 25%. Nearly 3 in 4 children, or 300 million children aged 2 till 4 years regularly suffer physical punishment and or psychological violence at the hands of parents and caregivers. And 1 out of 4 children aged under 5 years live with a mother who is a victim of intimate partner violence. We will talk about that. And sometimes we see in certain societies, or in fact in all societies, but in certain kinds of family compositions, that the woman is beaten by the husband, so domestic violence. We can be sure that in most of those cases, also the children are victims of abuse, certainly physical abuse, but often also sexual abuse. And you understand that in that situation, when the wife is a victim of physical abuse, she will not dare to stand up against her husband, because she would be abused or being the victim of violence again. So those children are really not protected in their family. 120 million girls and young women under 20 years of age have suffered some form of forced sexual contact. And as you see here in the note, Global Status Report on Preventing Violence Against Children. So it's not just in the West, or not just in Africa, not just in India or Asia, but it's all over the world. Those numbers are based on reports that came from several countries that are situated in all continents. So we have seen now how often and how widespread it is. And before we go further, we need to see it a bit in a schedule that can make clear about what we are talking. So this whole field is called child maltreatment. And under child maltreatment, you see we have 2 big streams. And one stream is the act of commission. That is when you do something you shouldn't do. And on the other side of the screen, you see acts of omission. That are acts that want you to do, that you need to do something, but you don't. So it's neglect. So on the left side, the acts of commission, we are talking about abuse. And on the right side, there are acts of omission, and they are called neglect. So there is, for instance, a journal that is called Child Abuse and Neglect. So now we understand those 2 parts of the field of child maltreatment. So if we are looking at the acts of commission, and we are going to explore that deeper in a moment, I'm just going to enumerate them now. So it's physical abuse, sexual abuse, and psychological abuse. Those are, this is an official schedule, I can say, but we should add for sure also spiritual abuse. But as you know, most of the world has become secular, and so it's more rare that we see that the spiritual abuse is part of bigger schedules. But I would like to add it here because there is also spiritual abuse, and during those courses we are going to talk about that. So if you look then at sexual abuse, you see the difference between hands-on and hands-off. On the right side, the neglect, it is first, it's a failure to provide. You are not giving something to the child that it needs and should get, has the right to get, or the failure to supervise. So inadequate supervision and exposure to violent environments. We are going to see that more in detail, but just for now, I want to say you that supervision is the best thing you can do to protect a child. It's the best. We can have procedures and so on, but when there are no adults good adults like parents or other caretakers who supervise the child, who know where they are, with whom they are, the child will never be protected. So supervision is the best way of protection. So the failure to provide, that is, you have to give something, namely more concrete, like education, physical or emotional care, and you don't give it. But we will see that in more detail in a moment. So we have already seen something about prevalence. So I want to go a bit deeper in that. And because there is much on this slide, I have put some colors on it. And so if you look at the yellow, you see sexual, physical, emotional abuse, and then neglect. This is a global report from UNICEF. You already know UNICEF on the former class, but I'm sure you knew it also before. And so it's important to see because it's global. Of course, from some countries, we do not have numbers, but if we have them, they are part of this report. So it is a review of 300 studies published between 2000 and 2017, and they examined self-reported lifetime prevalence. What does that mean? It means that they ask me, and I tell them what I have lived through. So it's not like doctors, it's not police records, it's what the people tell themselves about their own life. And they were asking about the prevalence for different types of child maltreatment. So if you look at sexual abuse, it had a median prevalence of 14 and 20% amongst European and North America's girls, respectively. So first boys, then girls. It was lower in boys, 6% in Europe and 14% in North America. So for the girls, 14 and 20%, European 14, North America 20. For the boys, 6 in Europe, 14% in North America. If you look at physical abuse, then the rates were more similar between boys and girls. So except in Europe, where the prevalence was 12% for girls and 27% for boys. So there we see that girls are less victims of physical abuse, but more victims of sexual abuse. Is 27 for boys. Furthermore, physical abuse prevalence was very high in some continents, with a prevalence in Africa of 60% of girls who suffered from physical abuse and 51% of boys. So more than half of the boys and half of the girls have suffered physical abuse in Africa. Now, let's go to emotional abuse in North America. They were the numbers were nearly twice as high for girls, 28%, than boys, 14%. And also in Europe, 13% in girls and 6% in boys. But they were similar across the sexes on other continents, to see it with my own words. So in North America and in Europe, boys and girls are have different rates of being victims of sexual abuse. Girls are more victim of emotional abuse than boys. However, that is not the case in other continents. So it's not only North America and Europe. So if you look now at neglect, I repeat, neglect is you should take care of them. You should do something and you don't. So they were the highest in Africa, 42 for girls and boys, 39. In South America, the girls suffered from neglect in 55% and the boys 57%, but were based on a few studies in total. By contrast, rates of neglect differed between the sexes in North America, 41 for girls and boys 17, but were similar in Asia. Of course, you don't have to study those numbers by heart, but it's important to see that the numbers are very high and that there is sexual, physical, and emotional abuse everywhere, as well as neglect. But that there are differences about the continents to know or to see which kinds of neglect or abuse are more prevalent than others. However, it is possible that we do not have enough studies in certain countries to make sure that the numbers are okay. I have learned during my long career in this field that numbers can change, and the more studies that are done, the more they are reliable. However, the fewer studies, the more you have to look at it with some hesitation, let's say, or let's say, okay, you have to say like, as for now, that's how it is. But we are waiting for more studies to confirm or to contradict. But those are the studies from a very renowned organization. So between 2000 and 2017, that is what we can say about the prevalence. Okay, here we go. So the acts of neglect. So there are two streams in the omission. So it's the failure to provide what you should do and you don't do. And it's also the failure of supervision. Let's have a look at it. So medical neglect, there is failure to supervise, exposure to violent environments, inadequate supervision, educational neglect, emotional neglect. Let's have a look at educational neglect. For instance, we know that in many countries, girls are not allowed to go to school, or it is very difficult for them to go to school. That's a form of neglect, because we have seen last class in the rights of the child, that every child has the right to go to school, to get education. So if they don't get the education they would like to have, then we can call it neglect. Emotional neglect is, for instance, you never say to your children or children in the class that you love them. Maybe in your culture, you don't use the term love, but there are several ways of showing that you care about the children. It's very important to say that, because we have had in Europe a time that we thought that saying that we love the children, that it was spoiling them and that it would make them arrogant and that they would think that they could do everything they wanted. That's not true, however. Children need to know that they are loved and cared for, because otherwise they have a very low self-esteem, and having a low self-esteem is very negative in their growing up and their later living their lives. Medical neglect, of course, in some regions it's not possible to see a doctor or a dentist. But if there is a possibility and you don't go with your children to the doctor when they are sick, it's a kind of neglect, or the same is for dental care. So if we go then, we have seen the points of omission. If we go now to the kinds of abuses, we first go have a look at physical abuse. So physical abuse includes all non-accidental physical injuries caused by a child's caretaker, for instance, the parents, but could also be teachers, for instance, it could even be nurses or other people. So it's non-accidental. And since in many countries physical abuse is forbidden, if they have to go to the doctor because the wounds are too important, then we will see that what they say is that it was an accident. They fell from the steps but of course, a good doctor after 3 times will know that it couldn't be an accident. And we had, I remember when I was teaching at the Gregorian, and we had some nurses in the class that we invited the doctor to tell them what kinds of injuries could be the consequence of an accident, and what kinds of injuries were certainly an indication that it was abuse. And we had certain nurses and social workers, and they were quite happy with that, because it became very clear when they had to talk about abuse and not about an accident. So the context of abuse can be extreme discipline. So in some countries, in some regions, in some families, there is this idea, or schools even, that you have to break the will of the children. You have to be very severe, because otherwise it's going from worse to worse. And so they use physical abuse, physical punishments. In many countries, like in my country, you cannot even as a parent hit your child anymore, and not even a little bit. It's forbidden by law. But before it wasn't. And so then there is certainly a difference between extreme discipline and normal discipline, let's say. So inappropriate punishment is also using, I remember when I was in Haiti, I went with the priest who was responsible for those Catholic schools, and we went to visit some schools. And one of the boys was outside in the sun, and I can assure you that in Haiti, there is lots of sun. He had to stand on his one leg and with his hands in the air, because he was punished. This is an inappropriate punishment. Also, the priest with whom I was visiting those schools said, and he said, you can go in, and he called the teacher. Maybe because I saw it, I don't know. But these kinds of punishments are not done and are not helpful, because they make the child angry. They are looking for revenge. And if they can't get to revenge when they are children, they might end up in gangs or in other, because they feel so a resentment against society and against people that they will not be helpful citizens of the country and of the world. So punishments have to be reasonable. So it also happens because of lapses in self-control. If you are immature and you become very angry, you hit or whatever. Too much stress, alcohol abuse, so people have no control on their actions anymore, or drugs abuse. And the forms of abuse, of course, are kicking, shaking, pushing, choking, throwing, burning, stabbing. All that is sometimes done. I have some trouble to go to the next slide, so let's have a moment. I'm sorry. Okay, what's going on? It went till now. So, okay, we do this next. So emotional abuse or psychological abuse is often used with the same, how should I say, same meaning, same signification. And it's a pattern of behavior that impairs a child's emotional development or self-worth. So the forms of emotional abuse are persistent lack of concern for the child's welfare, treating siblings unequally, belittling, humiliating the child, rejecting the child, constantly blaming. You are worth nothing. You are not. Why are you writing so badly? Why didn't you make your homework? You can't sit with the rest of the class anymore. I put you on a different chair. So making the child feel small, humiliated child, that's a kind of emotional abuse. It's very important that we do as Jesus did, and as we have seen in the last class, to value the child. And one thing I learned, because I've also been teaching in secondary school, is when a child is what we call bad, difficult in the class, it always has a reason. No one is aggressive or is difficult just for that, just they want to be difficult. No, there is always something going on. And the right question is, why is this child acting like this? What is going on in his or her life that it does like this? And using emotional abuse to make the child quiet and to silence him is not a good idea. So sexual abuse is an abuse not only on a sexual level, but in fact on several levels. And that's important to see. It is in the first place an abuse of power, because if you have no power over the child, you could not abuse it. It will simply run away. It's because you have power. For instance, the father in the family provides the food, provides the roof, provides other things. So he has power over the girl or the boy, and that makes it possible to abuse the child. It's always an abuse of trust. It's an abuse of trust because the child comes close to the one who is going to abuse him or her. And it is that trust, like in a father or in a teacher or in the neighbor or in an uncle, that that's abused. We know that all forms of abuse, it's mostly someone the child knows. I know it is possible gang rape and so on. In India, there has been many difficulties with it, and also Paraguay, I know that. But mostly a child is abused by someone he or she knows. And the perpetrator starts to have a relationship with the child so that the trust grows. And then at a certain moment, he is going to abuse that trust. And the abuse of trust is very hard to restore, because a child will lose trust in persons, in not only in the abuser, but in all persons, because the child has learned that that trust can be abused. And so it will not trust anyone anymore. And all therapists are going to tell you that to restore trust, to make someone trust again, is very difficult. And of course, it is also a sexual abuse. And we will see what I mean. The aim is sexual gratification at the moment itself or even later. But it's also a spiritual abuse, because if a child is abused, it will ask questions about God. Why does God allow that to happen to me? Why does God not intervene? All those spiritual questions come to the forward, and we have to be aware of that. It's an abuse of power. So power can be used in a very positive way. That's what we do when we educate. We use our power to transfer our values, our knowledge. So power is in itself not negative. Power can be very positive. However, in an abuse of power, when there is a difference in power between the one who abuses and the one who abuses, it's used in a negative way. And one of the things that all victims are going to tell you is that they felt very powerlessness the moment they were abused, because they couldn't, of course, a child and an adult, you cannot oppose. You want to run away, you can't. You want to put him away from your body, but you can't, because he has a big and heavy body and you are just a child. So this feeling of powerlessness is often also transmitted to other levels. Namely, they think that when they grow up, that they can't do anything. So it's like this feeling of powerlessness overflows the whole character and of the person. So the abuse of trust, trust is the capacity to rely on someone, to put your faith in someone, and to know that the other is not going to harm you. So when abused, you lose your trust into others. So about sexuality, I said we will say something more about sexuality. Well, I found a very nice definition, one of the best I ever found, in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, where it says that sexuality affects all aspects of the human person in the unity of body and soul. So sexuality, you see it here, has to do something with the soul as well. It's not only the body. It especially concerns affectivity, the capacity to love and to procreate in children, but also in the sense of being fruitful in society, in the church, and in a more general way, the aptitude for forming bonds of communion with others. In case of abuse, all those fields are affected. So it's not only the sexuality that is affected. No, it's the affectivity, the capacity to love God, the capacity to have faith in God. So we have to make a difference between hands-on and hands-off abuse. Hands-on is if there is sexual contact directly, fondling and penetrations, child prostitution, meaning you are abusing a child that is a prostitute, genital manipulation, and touching. In general, it's not so difficult to convince people that all those kinds are abuse. So my main point here is it's not only penetration that is sexual abuse, also touching the sexual organs is abuse. Also with penetration, even if it is oral, with the sex of the other, it is abuse. It's not only penetration. But a bit more difficult to understand is that there is also hands-off abuse. It's not only by touching, it is without direct contact. For instance, sexual activities in front of a child. I think here of exhibitionism. And I know a girl in my class when I was very young, she had seen one. So her father she went with her father to a film for families. And when they came out, it was Mary Poppins. And when they came out, he said, I'm going to get a car, just waiting for me. When she was waiting, she saw an exhibitionist, and that's someone who shows his genital in public. And she got such a shock because she had never seen a man naked and not a man with sexual, with an erection. And after that, she started to behave like a child of 10 years younger. She started to dress her again like a child, her hair like a child of 5 years old, and change her voice, because she hoped that when she would be really a child, 5 or 6 years old, that wouldn't happen to her. So she had to go to a psychiatric institution for almost a year, and then she came back to school. But you see, even without contact, it can deeply influence a child. So making pictures, I met someone who said, my father, we had to be naked, and then he took pictures. So that is, if you know it still when you are 50 and you don't feel good about it, it's a kind of abuse. Verbal sexual harassment, and exposing the child to sexual activities like, for instance, pornography. And here we have exhibitionism again, or all actions that enable child prostitution, or for instance, forcing someone to watch prostitution. All of that is also sexual abuse and can have very negative consequences. So what is the definition of the World Health Organization of sexual abuse? Well, it is defined as, and I read slowly, the involvement of a child in a sexual activity that he or she does not fully comprehend. Often they don't know what is happening exactly. The child is unable to give informed consent to. They might say yes, but the consent is not informed. They do not know to what they say yes, or for which the child is not developmentally prepared. The child is not mature sexually, or else an action that violates the laws or social taboos of society. Because in some society, it's not in laws, but it's really a social taboo. So you don't do it, it's abuse. Children can be sexually abused by both adults and other children. Yes, other children when they are in power, when they are much older, for instance, a boy of 18 years old and his little sister of 9 or 10 years old, it's abuse. Among siblings, it's possible. Then it's not only incest, but it's also abuse. So they can do it by other children who are older, so by virtue of their age or stage of development. So when they are in a position of responsibility, trust, or power over the victim. This is a definition of the World Health Organization that had been accepted by most of the countries. So the issue of consent, I already touched on that, but what's important to know is that consent is never valid when it is given by a child or even by a vulnerable person, because you're dependent on the person who is going to abuse you. You're dependent on him for physical reasons, because he's your teacher, because he's your father, because he's your priest. So you're dependent on him. So you can't say no. Or even you're dependent on him from what you get from him, money or other things. So the child does in fact not understand what he consents to, and he might not be aware of the sexual standards in her or his community, and doesn't know about the possible consequences that he's going to suffer so long in his life. And also, the child is not equally powerful. So coercion influences the child's decision. And if you are not free, we will see that later, even the Pope says it in Processis Lux Mundi. If you feel coerced, if you are not free, really free, to consent to the abuse, to the sexual relationship, then you are abused. So we are reaching the end of our class, but sorry, I want to talk about spiritual abuse. So spiritual abuse, the abuse, whether it's physical, sexual, by a priest or by someone else, it always affects one's spirituality. But even more so if the abuser is in one way or another a representative of the church. Always a child will ask why God does not intervene. But of course, if someone is abused by a priest who, in a certain sense, the child might see as a representative of Christ or even as God in the world, the spiritual abuse is worse. And the connection with God becomes very strong for the child. But it's not only by a priest, but it's much more by a priest or a bishop or another representative of the church, even a female religious, for instance. So abuses, physical, emotional, sexual, if it is done by a representative of the church, many lose their faith because of the abuses that have happened. Abuse affects always, and that's also spirituality. It's not only the relation with God, but it also affects the vision on the world. The world isn't lived as a good place. The other cannot be trusted. And the self, well, maybe I am not worth anything because this is happening to me. I must be a bad child. So it also affects the belief, if it is by a priest, it affects the belief in God and all priests, in the church as a whole, and in the church authorities in more specifically, especially if a child goes to denounce the abuse and nothing happens with the denouncement, then there is a big loss in the credibility of the church. So our conclusion for today, because sexual abuse has been the greatest evil that has touched the church, or let's say the kind of evil that has made the biggest scandal. Let's look at sexual abuse now. It's an abuse of power, we have said, of trust and spirituality. And of course, it's also sexual transgression that can be hands-on or hands-off. Children cannot give valid consent because they are not adults. They're not mature. They can't. Even if they give their consent, it's not valid. Mostly sexual abuse does not come alone, but is accompanied by other forms of abuse or neglect. For instance, most of the time it's connected with psychological abuse. So to make the child listen to the perpetrator, being submissive to the perpetrator, he often uses psychological mechanisms. We will talk about that later. And all types of abuse leave scars: physical, emotional, sexual, or spiritual abuse as such. We will talk about that later. So, sisters, have a nice week, and I see you again next week. Bye-bye.